going to talk about the role of the media in firearm violence. And in doing that, I think it's important to talk about this topic in terms of three major subheadings. So first of all, the media can have influences on suicide, on homicide, and potentially on murder-suicide. And I say murder-suicide, which is the intersection of homicide and suicide, because mass shootings, which are something we have on our mind quite a bit these days, are really very often a subset of the murder-suicide category. And in talking about media influences, it's important to distinguish between news, the stuff that gets put on the TV at night when you're watching that 11 o'clock news, versus the stuff that you go to the movie theater to watch, or television during the evening when you're watching entertainment, or for young people playing video games. And the influence of the news media or the entertainment media are very different depending on the age of the audience. And I'm going to really focus on that because youth, ages 14 to 24, appear to exhibit a disproportionate burden of gun violence. And there's good reason to believe that that's directly associated with their heavy use of entertainment media. So what are some of the influences that might be going on? Well, as it might not seem obvious, the influences of news are particularly potent on suicide, and we've known this for a long time. There's a very strong imitation effect. The effect is disproportionate on young people. And I think this is relevant for mass shootings, which in many cases are murder-suicides, and that's a form of suicide. And so news influences on mass shootings have become a source of interest for researchers. And they become much more frequent over the last 20 years. This graph shows you the amount of time between mass shootings, public mass shootings in the United States. And if you look at that graph, it's pretty clear that back in the 70s, it took a long time between these events, and nowadays this has become compressed, so we have many more of these events. And there's this group, the Towers et al. Paper that was published in PLOS One, that said, well, can we understand this as a contagion effect, which is produced primarily by news reporting? And they looked at different definitions of mass shootings, and you've got to remember the mass shootings are not as, they're complex. Many of them involve people in their family, so you have a perpetrator who ends up killing his family. It's usually a male. And it ends up being categorized as a mass shooting. But you also have school shootings. There you're more likely to have young people involved, as we saw in the recent case in Florida. For all of these cases, they were able to develop a model, a contagion model, and if you look at the data, the green line is what was attributable to contagion. So you can see that it doesn't explain all of it, but you could certainly build a model that says that when there's a recent event, there'll be another one within a certain amount of time that you could attribute to that event. And one of the problems with that, I think, is that they're so frequent nowadays that almost any model, I think, would fit these data. So that's a bit of a limitation. Now let's look at the entertainment side of the ledger. But I'm going to argue that the popular culture, which is embodied in movies, television, video games, also has an influence on firearm ownership, because these influences tend to glorify the use of guns and weapons, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. That has an influence on young people because young people get socialized in part through entertainment media. It's not a big surprise. We've seen the effect on alcohol, tobacco, sex. Wherever you look at things that are a little risky, young people are influenced by what they see in the movies, on television, and potentially in video games. So I'm going to propose that those kinds of influences could be a factor in encouraging firearm ownership and use. This is a pretty astounding finding. So someone did a regression of the rate of spending on gun movies across 25 countries, and found that if you put that in a regression equation, that would predict gun ownership in those countries. One of the things we've identified is a massive increase in gun violence in popular movies. That started when PG-13 became a popular rating in the movie industry, which allows anyone to watch. And the gun violence there grew rapidly in the 80s. I'm going to suggest that might have had something to do with why we saw the rapid increase among young people. I'm going to end with a few comments about the type of violence that we see in the movies and on television. And this is research we've done in particular to try to identify, is there any violence that young people could watch that would discourage them from engaging in gun violence. And so what we found is that movies with violence in which people are engaging in the gun violence or other forms of violence for the sake of self-defense, protection of the family, is seen as justified. And a lot of the PG-13 movies have that kind of violence, I'm sorry to say. We also have found, and if we ask parents to watch these movies, they're much more willing to allow their adolescents to view justified gun violence. So this is another piece of evidence that there's a socializing effect of this kind of entertainment. We've also put adolescents in a scanner while they watch these movies. A research that we've done, a postdoc at the Policy Center named Aziz Adebempe, and along with Daniel Bassett in the School of Engineering. And we can see clear differences in how young people respond to justified versus unjustified violence. So we know there's a difference in their brain response. So I'm just going to have one more slide. So the high penetration of gun ownership makes firearms available. The news media can have an influence on murder-suicide potentially. The entertainment media, we still don't know quite how it would factor into firearm violence, but speculatively, I think it could encourage acquiring a weapon. And this is, I think, especially likely for youth if the gun use is portrayed as justified, and we need a lot more research.